Hello, my name is Nishan Lama, and today I'll be talking about the history of Richmond, redlining, segregation, and the cause behind it, plus the continuing effect of it today. First of all, we need to learn about the history behind segregation and redlining because it gives us a more clear answer to why it is happening and a direction on how we can solve it. And the point of this presentation is to exactly answer why segregation exists today in Richmond. So first, I will talk about how it all started in the US. So in 1929, the stock market crashed as investors started to sell their shares, and that left many unemployed, with banks and companies closing down. Then FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president during that time, came up with a New Deal to try and relieve the effect of the Great Depression. In it, there was PWA, Public Works Administration, and FHA, Federal Housing Administration. PWA created jobs, public work projects, including constructions of public buildings and roads. It was one of the largest expansions of the government in US history, designed to pull the country out of the Depression, while the FHA provided mortgage insurance for loans that were strictly for white people. Another New Deal program called HLC created a residential security map known as redlining. So, redlining is the discriminatory practice of denying borrowers access to credit based on the racial and socioeconomic makeup of the neighborhood where properties are located. It was created by the HOC, Housing Owners Loan Corporation, as a guide to the banks to tell them where they could give loans to. And as you can see on the map, it's a map of Oakland and how it is color coded differently. So, what does the colors mean? Well, it means what areas were good to give loans to. It is important because it helped in creating spatial segregation and the racial income gap today. The green on the map represents the best people to give loans to. First grade, the blue section meant desirable, the yellow areas meant declining and there is risk. The red areas meant hazardous and there is high risk. However, why are these color coded the way they are? It is because of the people living there. The green and areas were occupied by white people, while the yellow and red areas were occupied by black people. The green areas represented white middle class areas because it didn't have a single black person in their neighborhood. The blue section was in danger of black people moving in. The yellow section already had black people living there, and they were living with white people, while the red section was fully a black neighborhood. In 2016, it was recorded all the red-lined areas that were classified as best is 91% MUI, middle upper income today, and the desirable neighborhoods are 72% middle upper income today. Neighborhoods split between low middle income and middle upper income, and the hazardous neighborhoods are low middle income today. So as you can see, race was related to real estate values, as where Black people were, the housing market value would be low. Many people know the 13th Amendment as the amendment that was put after the Civil War and how it ended slavery. However, many don't know that it also prohibited any discrimination based on race. And redlining goes exactly against what the 13th Amendment is about and discriminates against Black people. However, why is this important and why are we talking about it? Because it is redlining that helped in creating segregation today. But how? It made it difficult for Black people to buy houses outside of segregated neighborhoods and segregated neighborhoods because the real estate wouldn't show them a house, nor would the FHA allow it. Meaning, while the white people were moving into suburbs built by the government and sold for low prices to white people, the Black people were stuck in segregated neighborhoods and kept from gaining wealth, as though houses would later gain insane value and be a source of wealth to the white people. White people. Redlining also lowered the housing market in areas colored yellow and red, which also kept them from gaining wealth, as they would not get the same money selling the house compared to in a white neighborhood. While the houses in the suburbs are passed down to the families and gaining wealth each generation, the houses in Black neighborhoods are constantly going down in value. However, why are these houses in the Black neighborhood losing value? It is because banks gave them higher interest rates, and as a result, they meant they wouldn't be able to pay back in time, pay them back on time and have a higher chance of losing their homes. During World War II, many Black people took in boarders as a way of income, and the boarders were usually family or friends from back home who they encouraged to move west. The overcrowded housing led to deteriorating housing conditions. Now on to another result of redlining, educational segregation. Due to redlining, the children in segregated areas have less educational support as the property values in segregated areas are less compared to the children in the west suburbs. Overcrowded neighborhoods meant overcrowded schools in such neighborhoods, another educational disadvantage. In states like Chicago, they had to respond to overcrowding by double shifting the students attending in morning, half in the afternoon. Children were denied educational rights, which had a direct impact on how much they made as an adult. From the statistics, I talked about how the hazardous areas are 74% low middle income and 63% minorities today. So, how much redlining has affected and is the reason behind the racial wealth gap today. You can see in a map of Richmond that shows the resource segregation in areas like Point Richmond, which has high resources compared to other parts of Richmond, which has low resources. Now let's talk about the reason why so many Black people moved to the northern states. As you can see on the map, between 1915 to 1970, Black people moved from southern states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and other states to western states like California, Washington, and Oregon. The first migration occurred during World War I due to white people moving in the army. The companies needed workers, and so they hired Black people and even gave them decent salaries, travel expenses, and apartments. The North promised social freedom, economic advancement, and stood in marked contrast to the Jim Crow existence in the South. It was also impossible to get a decent job, gain wealth, or even respectable status in the South. In the South. So Black people jumped when they got the opportunity to get an education, job, housing opportunities, and over 6 million Black people migrated from the South. There have been There have always been Black people in Richmond since its founding, and in 1910 there were 29 Black people out of 6,802. But by the mid 1940s, it rose to 270 Black people, and by 1942, it had become 5,673. Almost 125,000 Black newcomers settled in the Bay Area, and nearly 15,000 came to Richmond. However, what sparked even more Black people to migrate in the mid 1940s? It was the World War II. The US entered World War II in 1941, and the government invested billions of dollars in California for defense production. Richmond became a shipbuilding center because the city had a deep water port, and companies like Ford and Kaiser shipyards created jobs and opportunities for Black people. Between 1940 and 1947, the African American population in Richmond had become 13,780. Kaiser Shipyard was the main reason behind such growth in African American population. Kaiser Shipyard gave work to anyone Black, white, men, and women, anyone that went in came out with a job. While Black people were getting employment opportunities, they still suffered segregation by racially exclusionary policies. As you can see on the slide, from 1850 to 1975, there were many racially exclusionary policies and practices in the Bay Area, like the one passed in 1890 to 1917, explicitly racial zoning restricted the sale or lease of homes to specific racial groups, are the racially restricted covenants and homeowner association bylaws of 1880 to 1966, which was deed restriction prohibiting the sale or lease of homes to specific racial groups by laws, uh, restricting HOA housing owners association membership by race. Policies like these kept Black people from buying houses. These deeds exist today in some areas. Out of more than 50,000 private housing units constructed in the Bay Area from 1940 to 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, 1946, The white people in the suburbs also didn't like the idea of Black people moving in their neighborhoods. So when companies like Ford Motor moved to suburbs due to higher demands and tried to build apartments for their workers, the white people in those suburbs protested. As a result, the workers had to travel 1 or 2 hours, move to segregated areas, or quit their job. However, the government took part in heavily segregating Black and white people, not allowing them to live together. The police would often stop any people, Black person, and check if they were employed. This was to keep Black people from officially moving into white neighborhoods. Also, with the rising population, the federal government decided to create public housing, which was heavily segregated. During the war, Richmond created over 24,000 public housing units for immigrant workers. In effect, the government had created a federal residential zone for war migrants. In Richmond, over half the population lived in public housing. The entire south side became a shipyard ghetto, basically dividing the city into separate communities of natives and newcomers. The public housing for white people were near the suburbs and in a good environment, while the public housing for Black people were near the railroad tracks and only for temporary use and was built very weakly. There were also less public housing for Black people compared to white people when Black people were the ones that needed it the most. In 1950, Article 34 was passed. This article kept public housing from being built until majority of electors of the city voted on it, which became a barrier to affordable housing, and it continues to be a problem today. Byron Rumford stood up and decided to. So Byron Rumford stood up and decided to change the laws that put Black people at disadvantage, and became the first Black person elected to the California legislature for the Bay Area. His bills helped Black people get jobs, school, housing, and other opportunities. Byron Rumford's most famous achievement was the 1963 Rumford Fair Housing Act. It was passed to help racial discrimination by property owners and landlords who refused to rent or sell their property to colored people in California. However, then came Prop 14 in 1964, which stated that no one could deny, limit, or abridge the right of any person who is willing or desires to sell, lease. The people were scared that if the Black people moved to their neighborhoods, it would lessen their house value and that they would take over the neighborhood. The people voted for the Prop 14 Republican Prop 14. The people voted to pass Prop 14. Republicans supported Prop 14, and CRE, a real estate agent company, funded Prop 14 because they were afraid it would destroy their control over housing markets. Proposition 14 was passed with overwhelming votes. However, in 1967, the Supreme Court declared Proposition 14 unconstitutional. Housing segregation continues even with the Fair Housing Act being passed in 1968. While housing discrimination became illegal, housing segregation continued. The government did not enforce it like other racially exclusionary policies. Real estate agents even encouraged housing segregation by steering Black people away and practicing blockbusting, where agents would introduce African American house owners to previously all white neighborhoods in order to spark rapid white flight and housing price decline. Well, what is white flight? It is the phenomenon of white people moving out of urban areas, particularly those with significant minority population, and into suburban areas. It occurred roughly from the 1940s to 1970s, which is basically white people moving out due to the fear of Black people and housing market getting lower. White flight is part of the reason why there is spatial segregation. There were many codes of ethics among the real estate agents that prevented them from selling houses to people of color, like Article 31, that strictly told realtors that they should not never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence would clearly be detrimental to the property values in that neighborhood, which meant they were not allowed to show Black people any houses in white neighborhoods because it would bring down the value of the house. The estate agents would go far as to create fake burglaries burglaries, or have a white woman or have a black woman walk the neighborhood and say to the white people that they were not safe, which would create an immense white fight. The real estate agents would then get the houses for cheap and sell the same house to the black people. To black people, the real estate would make thousands of dollars in profit. In cases where black people somehow bought houses from their white friends or a real estate agent, the black people would get harassed by the white neighborhoods and the police. They would go far as throwing rocks, physically assaulting them, and the police would do nothing. Then the government would intervene and they would blame the real estate agent or the house owner that sold the house. In most cases, the real estate agents were fired and the house owners were jailed. So the government had a huge part in supporting segregation. As you can see in the map, Point Richmond is filled with white people, while other parts of Richmond are filled with people of color. So with my research and presentation, the reason why segregation exists today in Richmond and other cities in the US is due to government policies that enforce segregation between white and black people. And as you can see, the result of segregation in Richmond. It shows areas like Point Richmond, which has less lead risk compared to the rest of Richmond, which has higher lead risk. You can also see on the map of the United States, there are many areas with high segregation. It's the current map of the US. The segregation has resulted in an overwhelming segregation on education, job opportunities, and health all over the states.